Number 7. Daredevil Season 2. Matt Murdock, the superpowered devil from Hell's Kitchen, is back. This time he has to deal with the war-hardened vigilante known as the Punisher, and an old femme fatale from his past named Elektra, who is tied to a mysterious ninja order known as the Hand. Now, I wasn't really a huge fan of Season 1 of the hugely successful Daredevil series, and to be honest, most of what I didn't like about Season 1 is still present in Season 2. It's just inherent to the show, I suppose. And nothing is going to change that at this point, so going in, I have to accept that their approach for the show doesn't really line up with mine, and it'll probably never be my cup of tea. The season opened real strong with the emergence of the Punisher, aka Frank Castle, who arrives in Hell's Kitchen and begins taking out the mob still operating there in the absence of Wilson Fisk. The first 4 episodes were really strong as Daredevil takes on the Punisher. At first he fails. Frank captures Daredevil and chains him on a rooftop where they debate their ideological differences to fighting crime. Or as Frank aptly describes it, when you put them down, they get back up. When I put them down, they stay down. It's a very charged episode, and Frank presents Daredevil with the impossible choice by strapping a gun to Matt's hand and giving him the opportunity to either kill the lowlife that Matt and his lawyer guys was defending, or kill Frank himself. The episode ends with some relentless action as Daredevil goes through probably 30 gang members just to reach the bottom of the building's stairwell. Eventually, the Irish mob captures Frank and tortures him. Matt comes to his aid, and Frank tells him the story of his family's murder. Now, as I said, these 4 episodes really work together well, and I'd really love it if they were edited together. You could make a pretty great 3-hour Daredevil movie if you take out some of the unnecessary padding. I really enjoyed seeing the clash of these two titans, where Matt still believes in law and order, while Frank believes in using extreme measures. I always said the Punisher works best as a character when he's set against someone with a moral center greater than his. And Daredevil is a great character to be his counterpart, as they also clashed in the comics many times over the years. John Bernthal does a good job of playing Frank. He comes across more unhinged than the Thomas Jane version, which was played a bit more sympathetic. But despite his argument being compelling to an extent, as I said, Frank really isn't a guy you're supposed to root for. While I don't necessarily think he's a villain, he's a criminal in the strictest sense. That's why it's difficult for me to see him as the lead in his own recently announced series, unless they ultimately tone down his ruthless demeanor to a more manageable level. Needless to say, this depiction of Daredevil is everything Superman vs. Batman's Batman should have been. These early episodes did remind me a bit of The Dark Knight, where Daredevil is getting blamed for the Punisher's creation and the emergence of copycat vigilantes. Much like Nolan's take, they stress the real-world trappings a bit too much for my taste. It's certainly far tonally beyond what Marvel has done outside of Netflix. Matt's law partner, Foggy Nelson, however, does share his secret, and the effects of bearing that secret take its toll on their friendship over the course of the season. And it's sad to witness since they have great chemistry together. Charlie Cox, Eldon Henson, and Deborah Ann Wall are the heart of the show, and they continue to impress at every turn. Matt's priest still has a minor presence in the show, and I'm glad they didn't entirely forget about him. And of course, Matt's Catholicism is given some needed screen time as well. Just as things are starting to happen between Matt and his pretty secretary Karen Page, Matt's old psycho ex-girlfriend Elektra shows back up. Elodie Young is okay, and her Elektra seems a bit more like her comic book counterpart. But I don't think she became a killer back when Matt knew her in college. I could be mistaken. But here in her early days, she's quite a thrill-seeker. They don't really even attempt to give Elektra a costume in the early part of the season, much less her comic-accurate costume. She wears a black sleeveless outfit, not unlike Jennifer Garner's version, only with a red turtleneck collar that she pulls up to cover her face. She gets a slightly more authentic costume near the end. While all of this feeds into the theme at hand, where Matt is trying to stay on the side of the Angels, it really makes the story veer off into another direction. While the Punisher side of things sees Karen gain Frank's confidence, and Foggy's attempts to represent him at trial. I'm not sure I agree with having Frank taking a bullet to the skull being the cause of how he is, but it gives rise to his famous symbol at least. Much like last season, Karen begins a one-woman investigation, this time into Frank Castle's history. She literally steps into her old mentor Ben Urich's shoes. Or I guess I should say more accurately, his office. Unlike last season's subplot for Karen, this one is a bit easier to take. It is interesting how they could take a character like Karen and make her a better investigative reporter than Iris over on The Flash. Now, as I understand that the courtroom is going to play a part in the story, since Matt's a lawyer and having he and Foggy represent Frank at the trial of the Punisher was a no-brainer. But I'm not a fan of procedurals, and I did find myself losing interest in the whole subplot of the crooked DA that keeps trying to stymie Matt and Foggy's case. The Punisher craps his own trial and is sent to prison where Vincent D'Onofrio's Kingpin makes a welcome return. He orchestrates a plot worthy of his character to rid himself of an enemy and turn Frank loose in Hell's Kitchen once again. The series does tend to get a bit murky around this point. Stick returns to aid an injured Elektra, and he tells Matt about the Hand, the mysterious ninja clan. Eventually, Daredevil comes face to face with Nobu, the supposed incinerated red ninja who carved him up but good last season. And of course, if you know anything about the comic, you know the Hand somehow managed to cheat death at every turn. I could have done without the weird subplot of the zombie kids that are being bled for some nefarious plan of the Hand, but it gives Rosario Dawson's Claire Temple, aka Night Nurse, an excuse to show up for a few episodes. I did enjoy seeing some of Elektra's backstory with Stick. Stick sends some French assassin to kill her, and that's how she gets her trademark weapons, the dual size. Apparently, the Hand want Elektra to lead them as the Black Sky, an unstoppable killing machine. Meanwhile, Frank hunts down the blacksmith, the man who caused his family's death, which turns out to be his old CO, played by the great Clancy Brown. Kind of a shame Clancy doesn't really get a whole lot to do in the show, but he's always a treat. In the end, Frank spray paints a bulletproof vest with his skull symbol, and now armed to the teeth with the blacksmith's weapons, his transformation into the Punisher is complete. I thought the end was pretty exciting. I never would have called Nobu being the actual villain of the piece, but Daredevil and Elektra face incredible odds with the hope of surviving long enough to live happily ever after. As you might expect, Elektra falls in battle, and that really disappointed me, as I really wanted to see that scene play out with Bullseye, as it did in the Ben Affleck film. It was acted very well here, though. I also didn't like the mask coming off Daredevil in the end fight. I really hate when they do that, but practically all comic book films are guilty of it. I haven't rewatched my review for Season 1, but I think most of my complaints for this season are comparable to the last. I really feel that a lot of the fat could be trimmed from the show in order to improve some of the pacing issues the show has. It still tends to linger on scenes or subplots that are not all that interesting. It comes across much better this season, though, since for the most part, Barenthal's Punisher is a much more compelling monologuer than D'Onofrio's Kingpin. The action is much improved from last season. Daredevil is already suited up at this point, so we can just hit the ground running. However, I would prefer more spectacle. There's plenty of fighting, but not much in the way of Daredevil's acrobatic, swashbuckling nature. He's called Daredevil for a reason. Give us some real death-defying stunts, and for heaven's sake, don't be afraid to use a little CGI. As I've always said, say what you will about Arrow and the CW shows, but they do know how to put together some exciting action set pieces. Speaking of CGI, there's still no real use of Matt's radar sense. Part of the fun of a character's superpower is witnessing him using it, but here, it's still left to the viewer's imagination for the most part. The violence and profanity are still at times off-putting, much like last season. They seriously upped the brutality now that the Punisher and Elektra are involved. I still don't really see why I should be excited about this. I mean, graphic violence and a gritty tone seems to be a fanboy turn-on for some reason, and I'll never understand why. But I could have used a bit less grim and a lot less blood. What to look for should there be a Season 3? Well, we have the Kingpin swearing revenge against Matt, so I'm guessing he'll be a major force in the next season. Elektra will return as expected. Nelson and Murdoch seem to be finished. I really hope they get back together, though. And Karen is now a full-fledged reporter, so I'm guessing that will be explored. Kind of an interesting choice to go with for Karen. Not that I honestly expected them to go with the comic book route of her being a porn star, heroin addict turned Skid Row prostitute that got AIDS, but not really, and sold out Matt's secret before getting killed. And quite frankly, I'm glad they're not going there. It was a ridiculous amount of excess for the comic, and it's even more so in live action. I'm thinking Bullseye will wind up killing Karen, though. That might be why they didn't want him killing Elektra, but I definitely would like to see Bullseye in costume this time. So in the end, I think it was a much better season than last year due to the more compelling story and characters used here. It still has too many of the same problems holding it back as last season, however, for me to really improve my rating, so I'm going to give Daredevil Season 2 3.5 stars out of 5. That's what I gave Season 1, but I probably overrated that season a fair bit. I can't really put this show higher than middle of the road. It needs to be tightened up, so I don't go for that fast forward button anymore. And yeah, I still prefer the Affleck film. That's my review of Daredevil Season 2. This is Johnnie Torch reminding you once again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.